The Human Development Index, HDI, published annually by the UN, ranks nations according to their citizens' quality of life rather than strictly by a nation's traditional economic figures. The criteria for calculating rankings include life expectancy, educational attainment, and adjusted real income. The most livable countries in 2006 were Norway, Iceland, Australia, Ireland, and Sweden.
There once was a time in American history when the thought of women working for complex, multinational technology companies, giant advertising firms, and massive publishing houses was snickered at behind closed boardroom doors. Today, women are running those companies from some of those very same boardrooms. But although women make up almost half of America's labor force, as of 2005, only 8 Fortune 500 companies have women CEOs or presidents, and 67 of those 500 companies don't have any women corporate officers. Catalyst, the not-for-profit New York-based women's research organization, points out that its data shows a change over the last 10 years. In 1995, 8.7% of corporate officers in Fortune 500 companies were women. This percentage rose to 16.4% by 2005. While this is progress, they note that at this rate, it would take 40 years for the number of female corporate officers to match the number of male officers. For the few women who have reached the highest ranks, they'd prefer not to talk about their gender. To them, it's no longer an issue. Their accomplishments represent significant milestones, not just for women in business, but for women all over the world making career choices.
More than 1 billion people in about 70 countries around the world observe Daylight Saving Time, DST, in some form. Here are interesting facts about some of these countries. Most of Canada uses Daylight Saving Time. Some exceptions include the majority of Saskatchewan and parts of northeastern British Columbia. In the fall of 2005, Manitoba and Ontario announced that, like the United States, they would extend daylight time starting in 2007. The Attorney General of Ontario commented that it is important to maintain Ontario's competitive advantage by coordinating time changes with our major trading partner and harmonising our financial, industrial, transportation and communications links. Other provinces have indicated that they may also follow suit. It wasn't until 1996 that our NAFTA neighbours in Mexico adopted DST. Now all three Mexican time zones are on the same schedule as the United States.
Most kids plug into the world of television long before they enter school. According to the Kaiser Family Foundation, KFF, 2/3 of infants and toddlers watch a screen an average of 2 hours a day. Kids under age 6 watch an average of about 2 hours of screen media a day, primarily TV and videos or DVDs. Kids and teens 8 to 18 years spend nearly 4 hours a day in front of a TV screen and almost 2 additional hours on the computer outside of schoolwork and playing video games. The American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that kids under 2 years old not watch any TV, and that those older than 2 should watch no more than 1 to 2 hours a day of quality programming. The first 2 years of life are considered a critical time for brain development. TV and other electronic media can get in the way of exploring, playing, and interacting with parents and others, which encourages learning and healthy physical and social development.
According to adjusted calculations published by Statistics Finland, Finland's greenhouse gas emissions in 1990, the benchmark year for the Kyoto Protocol, amounted to 71.5 million tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent. This revised baseline figure is about 1 million tonnes higher than the previously calculated total of 70.5 million tonnes. This adjustment is due to improved calculation methods and does not affect Finland's commitment under the EU's internal allocation of emission reduction obligations to get emissions back down to 1990 levels by the period 2008 to 2012. Finland's latest emission figures form part of an inventory report submitted to the European Commission in mid-January. The report has been compiled by Statistics Finland, the organisation responsible for the National Greenhouse Gas Inventory System, and also features emission trends over the whole period 1990 to 2004. The report was additionally discussed by Finland's EU Affairs Ministerial Committee.
Good to be with you today. Thanks for making the time available. To start, just the key things I wanted to cover today related to this idea of assessment. And the main thing I want you to think about, the take-home message if you like, is that there are a number of different points in assessment. Well, starting on the left-hand side of the diagram, we have the less structured ways to assess students. Moving on to the right, the more structured methods. So we might go from, say, an informal observation about what is occurring in an incidental way, along to simply structured tools like questionnaires and observation reports, to things like students assessing themselves and moving forward with greater complexity, case studies and the like, and then on the far right-hand side, things like formal exams, public tests and standardized tests, the real high-stakes tests which many students, teachers and parents are concerned about.
Now, the topic we're going to focus on today is free speech. Presumably you're an advocate of free speech at some level, but let's start by getting clear. What do we mean by free speech?
By free speech, I mean the need for restrictions on the way in which governments can regulate speech. Whether speech is free in a further sense, that is, whether people have opportunities, is a very important thing, but it's not the issue of free speech.
That's really interesting because you immediately began by talking about regulation and controlling what can be said.
Well, certainly speaking isn't without costs. What people say can cause injury, can disclose private information, can disclose harmful public information. It's not a free zone where you can do anything because nothing matters. Speech matters. But because it matters, it's very important that governments who want to regulate speech, for example, to prevent things that would be embarrassing to politicians or otherwise upset the government, it's important that that power should be restricted.
We've known about symbiotic relationships, of course, for quite a long time. This is a more unusual example in that it's so large in area, it's underground, and there seems to be such a close and intimate relationship between the fungus and the trees. And so it's rather different from the examples that have been studied before. It's extremely interesting to think about the possibilities that this web of interrelationship opens up. And certainly you can imagine almost that the large trees are feeding the small ones. The small ones are managing to grow, perhaps not as fast as they would if they had access to all the light from above, but they are kept going, and it's almost as if the large trees are keeping them going until such time as a hole develops in the canopy and they can grow away to their full height. So that relationship between the large mature trees and the young saplings is most unusual, and I think there's a lot more that we need to understand about the precise links between them and how much material is passed from the adult trees into the saplings.
I started being interested in yonks back when I was about 8, when I got a chemistry set and a copy of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species as birthday presents, because they seem to be ways not merely of trying to understand the world and explaining how humans had emerged, but also to control the world. You could do experiments, you could control things, you could work out what might happen, you could test it. Knowledge and power, understanding the world and controlling and predicting bits of the world are really what being a scientist is about. I think one of the problems often that natural scientists have, that social scientists have, and a lot of the philosophers of science have, is that there's one thing called science. And the physical sciences and the biological sciences and the chemical sciences are all doing the same sorts of things. We're not. Physics and chemistry deal with really rather simple matters with a high degree of precision. The essence of biological living systems is complexity and non-reproducibility. The arrow of time works only in one direction for biology, and processes are always irreversible. That makes life very, very difficult indeed.
The lecture provided brief information on the United Nations Human Development Index, HDI. The index ranks nations according to their citizens' quality of life instead of merely economic statistics. In 2006, the top 3 most livable countries were Norway, Iceland, and Australia.
According to this speaker, historically in America, the notion of women working for complex, multinational companies was secretly mocked by male executives. In America today, however, women are running some of those companies. As of 2005, despite women comprising almost half of America's labor force, only 8 Fortune 500 companies have women CEOs or presidents. Moreover, it appears that the trend towards more women in top leadership positions has continued, although slowly, over the last 10 years.
Over 1 billion people around the world, in about 70 countries, use some form of daylight saving time scheme. In 2005, the Canadian provinces, Manitoba and Ontario, announced that they would extend daylight time. The reason for this was to coordinate time changes with their major trading partner, the U.S. The U.S.'s other neighbor, Mexico, has also adopted DST. Research suggests that 2/3 of infants and toddlers, as well as children under 6, watch a screen for about 2 hours a day. Older children watch TV for about 4 hours a day and spend 2 additional hours in front of the computer. It is recommended that children under 2 should not watch any TV. Children older than 2 should watch no more than 1 to 2 hours a day.
"1990 is the benchmark year for greenhouse gas emissions. In that year, Finland's greenhouse gas emissions amounted to 71.5 million tons of carbon dioxide or equivalent gases. This figure has been revised up from the figure of 70.5 million tons previously calculated. The adjustment is due to improved calculation methods.
According to the speaker, there are a number of key issues concerning assessment. Assessment can range from less structured ways of assessing students to very structured assessments. Informal measures include things such as informal observations. The next type of assessments that are slightly more structured are questionnaires and observation reports. The most structured kinds of assessment are formal exams, public tests, and standardized tests. These tests are high-stakes tests and are of concern to students, teachers, and parents. According to the lecture, free speech is defined as the need for restrictions on the way in which governments regulate speech. Free speech does not come without costs. Costs can include injury or damages to individuals or arise from the disclosure of harmful private or public information. Calls to regulate free speech usually emanate from the government.
The speaker details an unusual symbiotic relationship between fungus, saplings, and large trees. The cited example is considered unusual because it is in a large underground area. The speaker is of the view that the larger trees are providing sustenance for the smaller ones until such time as a hole develops in the canopy and the smaller trees can grow to their full height.
The speaker discussed his emerging interest in science stemming from an interest in understanding the world. Understanding the world and predicting aspects of the world are essentially what being a scientist is about. However, there are key differences between natural scientists and social scientists concerning science and the phenomena they study. Physics and chemistry deal with really rather simple matters with a high degree of precision, while the social sciences deal with more complex phenomena, but with less precision.